Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. In this video I want to spend some time talking a bit more about Van Inwagen's argument for incompatibilism, and then I want to take some time to talk about David Lewis's famous response to it. So I've said quite a bit about Van Inwagen's argument for incompatibilism in other videos, so if you search for Jeremy Dickinson philosophy, Peter Van Inwagen, you will find my videos on this topic. So I won't say too much about Van Inwagen's argument here, but I do want to say some things about it in order to set up David Lewis's response to it. And this response can be found in David Lewis's famous paper, Are We Free to Break the Laws? So the title of the piece should give you a hint as to how it is that David Lewis responds to Van Inwagen's argument. The answer there is going to be yes and no. So we'll see how that works out. Okay, so Van Inwagen, his argument for incompatibilism can be found in his work, An Essay on Free Will, and you can find it elsewhere in various papers. It also can be found, a version of it, in his book Metaphysics. So here's the basic intuition behind the argument. If we suppose determinism is true, then it seems to follow pretty immediately that the past and laws of nature entail everything that happens at a world. And if that's true, then it looks like everything that I do is going to be determined by the past and laws of nature. From this, it seems as if everyone's free will is going to be compromised, because part of what it means to have free will essentially is having the ability to choose what to do. But if the past and the laws of nature are determining everything that happens, or necessitating everything that happens, then it looks like my free will is compromised. So that's the intuitive formulation of the argument. Now, just maybe rough recap here is Van Inwagen's arguing for the thesis of incompatibilism, which is the thesis that free will and determinism can't possibly coexist. And we're understanding determinism here in a universal sense. So if determinism is universally true at a world, then free will would be impossible there, for the reasons roughly just mentioned. But if we were to look at just the premises of Van Inwagen's argument, just a very straightforward version of it, you would have the idea that there's nothing anyone could possibly do to render the laws of nature false. Second premise, there's nothing anyone could possibly do to render the past at any given time false. And then the third premise is just taking those first two premises, if you will, and combining them. There's nothing anyone could possibly do to render the conjunction of the laws of nature in the past false. And so those are the first three premises, as it were. Keep in mind that the argument supposing determinism, for the sake of showing that determinism is going to have unsavory implications. And of course, if a thesis has bad implications, we have reasons to reject that thesis or the theory. So we have the first three premises. Now, it's really the fourth premise that gives us a logical implication, Van Inwagen thinks, of determinism. So determinism understood as the idea that the past and the laws of nature, they necessitate everything that happens at a world, or that they necessitate, more accurately, in Van Inwagen's discussion of it, a single physically possible future. Well, then it seems to immediately follow that the past and the laws of nature really entail everything that happens at a world. And thinking about determinism, we're thinking about the future, but it would also apply to the past. So the past and the laws of nature would entail everything that happens in the future, everything that happens at the present, everything that happens in the past as well. Okay, but setting that aside, so the fourth idea just gives us a logical consequence. So sometimes the argument is called the consequence argument because the argument relies on a logical consequence that Inwagen claims of determinism. And that logical consequence is captured again in this fourth premise as the idea that the laws of nature and the past, they entail everything that happens at a world, and there's nothing anyone could possibly do to render that false. So now we have that fourth premise, and it's just going to follow, it seems like, from that third premise, that there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render the laws of nature and the past false. And the fourth premise, namely that there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render false, the fact that the laws of nature in the past entail everything that happens out of the world, the claim that that everything, that there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render false everything or anything that happens out of the world. And that seems to be the crucial implication, because that leads to the further implication that that free will is impossible, again, once we suppose determinism. Free will is going to be impossible because part of what it means to be free is to be able to determine what you do and to make choices between alternative possibilities that seem open to us or open to you, in the sense that they're physically possible options for you to choose between. So that's just to summarize the argument in a bit more logically rigorous way than the intuitive formulation, but the idea is the same. And I wanted to set up the argument in this more rigorous way in order to set up Lewis's response to it and set up the premise that Lewis goes after. Because we think about Van Wagen's argument, there's a couple different ways of going here. You can challenge a premise, or you could challenge an inference that he makes. And there's been a lot written and a lot said about the inference that's made between premises 3 and 4 to get to the conclusion that there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render anything false out of the world. The relevant inference principle there that Van Wagen develops is called beta, as I've mentioned in other videos. But I'm not going to say much more about that here. Lewis seems to grant beta for the sake of the argument, and he deals with another issue in the argument instead. So I'll say more about beta in other videos. Van Wagen has agreed that beta is faulty and fallacious, so he revised it. So he was pressed to revise, and he did accordingly. But that's not where Lewis presses anyway. So Lewis wants to challenge the Van Wagen's argument for incompatibilism. Again, this argument is known as the consequence argument, the no-choice principle argument, or the untouchable fact argument. We find different names for it, different formulations of it, even in Van Wagen's work. But I think the version I presented captures maybe the most intuitive one that's out there. If you disagree with that, you can post that in the comments. I'd be happy to talk with you about that and get some feedback on that point. Now, so let's talk about Lewis for a moment. Lewis wants to say that there's a faulty premise in Van Wagen's argument, and thinking about the argument, it seems like it's going to be tough to challenge one of them. And he goes after one of the premises that you wouldn't think could be challenged because it just seems so good. And he goes after the premise that there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render false the laws of nature. And you think about that and you think, well, what kinds of powers would I have to falsify the laws of nature, the laws of gravity, for example, or other laws of nature. And so on what grounds could Lewis possibly challenge this premise? Well, Lewis wants to say that this premise is ambiguous, and that there's a premise, there's a formulation of it that turns out to be true, but it doesn't lead to the incompatibilist conclusion that Van Wagen wants. And there's another formulation of it that just turns out to be false. So a way of thinking about what Lewis is doing here generally, the strategy is to show that either Van Wagen's argument's invalid because it has a true premise that doesn't support the conclusion properly, or the argument is bad because it has a false premise. So let's see if we can understand in more detail what Lewis has in mind here. That's the overarching structure of what happens. So, okay, so there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render the laws of nature false. That's the relevant premise under question here. Excuse me. And the first formulation of it that Lewis develops is the more straightforward one, and it goes like this. There's nothing anyone could possibly do render the laws of nature false, in the sense that there's nothing anyone can possibly do to cause the laws of nature to be false by something that he or she does. So on this interpretation of the premise, the idea is just that no one can cause the laws of nature to be false by or through some action of his or hers. And Lewis says just straightforwardly that this claim is true. No one can cause a law of nature to be false. No one has that kind of power, no doubt. And so he says that claim is true, but ultimately he thinks it doesn't support the conclusion that determinism rules out free will. And this is because what Lewis thinks is that that the compatibilist is not arguing that one would have to have the power to cause the laws of nature to be false in order to act freely. So and this really comes out thinking about the next formulation of the premise involving the laws of nature. So just to recap the point here, so it's clear, Lewis is saying that we have a true premise if we understand the premise in the way described. No one has the power to cause the laws of nature to be false. But then he says the compatibilist doesn't think that you have to have that power in order to act freely in the first place. So you may have a true premise there, but you don't then have a valid argument, because now the premise isn't properly supporting the conclusion. So that's the first formulation. The second formulation of the premise, again, to anticipate, it's going to turn out by Lewis's lights to be false. But here's how it goes. There's nothing anyone can possibly do to render the laws of nature false, in the sense that there's nothing anyone can possibly do, the doing of which would imply that the laws of nature are false. Okay, so in this claim, causality is taken out of the interpretation of that second premise involving the laws of nature. We're not saying that Lewis is saying that there's a way of interpreting that premise that doesn't rely on thinking about the laws of nature being falsified as a result of someone directly causing the laws of nature to be false, or indirectly causing the laws of nature to be false. Rather, we need to think about the falsification of the laws of nature in virtue of me doing something or someone doing something, the doing of which implies that they're false, not because they're caused to be false. And I think this is really the trickiest thing to get in Lewis's paper on this topic. It's the trickiest thing to understand about Lewis's argument against Van Inwagen. So setting aside the premise just for a second here in the interpretation of the premise, let's just think about the following. The thing about maybe in terms of a question: is there anything anyone could do, the doing of which would imply that the laws of nature are different from what they in fact are? Were I to do something, is it possible for me to do something, the doing of which would imply that the laws of nature would have been different, okay, than what they in fact are? And what Lewis wants to say is, yeah, of course there is. Had I done differently, so had I had different beliefs and desires, perhaps, or just had I done differently, then the laws of nature would have been different than what they in fact are, just as sort of like a logical point. So there is something someone could do, the doing of which would imply that the laws of nature are false, in the sense that they are other than what they in fact are in the actual world. And so if this is true, then it's just false to say that there's nothing anyone could possibly do, the doing of which would imply that the laws of nature are false. Because there are lots of things that people could do or could have done, which would have implied that the laws of nature are different from what they in fact are. So that's really Lewis's response to this argument. And he says this is perfectly compatible with compatibilism. Perfectly consistent, in other words, with compatibilism, because compatibilist wants to say that we can be free and determined at the same time. So go to a world where universal determinism is true, we can still be free. So that is Lewis's main challenge to Lewis's argument for incompatibilism. I have to stop here. Please email me or comment below if you have any